given that the state of emergency is likely to expire soon, I don't know why we need to take action.
And that's Councilmember Lisa Herbold there talking about the proposed end of the $4 an hour pay raise for grocery workers that's been in place since February to help those workers during the pandemic. Some question marks about that. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the story behind that group of Seattle police officers who attended the January 6th insurrection in our nation's capital. And would you pay $12 an hour to park on Seattle streets? Well, the answer to these questions and more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. Brian Callanan here. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own. And I am back with Kevin Schofield of Seattle City Council Insight after a quick summer break. Kevin, you look tanned, rested, and ready. Or at least the rested and ready part, certainly.
Well, it didn't help me from looking completely washed out on Converge last week, and my first time in the studio.
Yeah.
And I am Casper the Friendly Ghost.
We'll get working on makeup on that. Not to worry. Thank you, sir, and thanks also to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast. Please support them, other small businesses too. Thanks also to our patrons for supporting our show. Cliff just joined us a short while ago, and he told us this, Kevin. Happy to support the show. I just moved here a few months ago, and it's been a very nice way to get plugged in to local politics. So very awesome to hear that. Thanks a lot, Cliff. He is supporting us at the $10 level, so we're sending him his very own Seattle News, Views, Brews coffee mug. These are awesome. We will send you one if you're able to support us in that way. And at that point, you can send us some great photos like this one, our mugshot of the week from Thomas on a bistro table where he actually found some shade, it looks like, during our hot start to the summer. Thank you, Thomas, and stay cool, everybody out there. Thanks to everybody who supports this show. We could still use your help. Do support independent journalism if you like what you're hearing here. Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. We also thank Converge Media. Converge, of course, airs the video version of our podcast on their YouTube channel Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get you up to date with right here, right now. All right, let's knock out a couple of headlines here for what's happening in this second full week of July. The council is set to approve a strategic plan for City Light, including what they call a rate path. Now, if you're keeping score at home, that's a fun way to say your rates are going to be increasing, an average of 3.5% over the next 5 years. That's lower than what the last strategic plan was talking about, a 4.5% increase. But Kevin, we've touched on this before in the podcast. There are some challenges ahead for City Light. It's not completely clear to me where the demand for electricity is going to go in the near future or even in the long term here. Some thoughts about this?
Yeah, it's an interesting business because they have a large amount of just overhead, fixed overhead for, the distribution grid, right? Mm-hmm. And while we've been doing a better job of conservation, even just the basic things like LED bulbs, the proliferation of LED bulbs is dramatically, it just alone has dramatically reduced, electricity usage in the city.
And that residential load is a big part of the fluctuations.
And really everywhere. Yeah. They still have to have the grid. Right. And they still have to build out the grid for maximum usage when we're all, running the heat during the winter or all running fans on the day when it hits 106 in Seattle. Mm-hmm. So, the investment they have to make in their infrastructure hasn't really changed. Yeah. And in fact, continues to grow as the population of the city continues to grow. Right. But their revenues are actually not growing, along with that. In the meantime, they also have to make investments in their workforce because they got a lot of people that are retiring and they need to train a whole set of new people. Yeah. They need they're making a bunch of customer service improvements in their strategic plan. Mm-hmm. They're doing a bunch of grid modernization stuff and clean energy investments. So they got a whole bunch of things going on that cost money. But they've really been trying to push hard to see if they can keep rates low.
Certainly during COVID, I know there was a big push around that. Yeah.
They've been benefiting from doing more wholesale power sales than they thought they could because everybody wants their clean hydroelectric power. Right. They think they're about to get a rate cut from Bonneville,
BPA,
BPA, where they buy a huge amount of their power from.
Yes.
So the part that they're not generating directly. So they actually think this year, they've managed to have no rate increase.
Yes.
Next year, they think it's going to be about 2%.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it's going to be a little higher than that in the years to follow.
Right. In looking at that, it's just interesting. And I know you've brought this up before in Seattle City Council Insight. as we see more of our transportation system getting electrified, if you will, as we see more of the different homes in our area and buildings becoming electrified. I know the council is talking about that too, not putting in natural gas in a lot of these new multifamily housing units there. I think that's going to have an impact on the load and the demand for electricity for Seattle City Light as well.
Yeah, what it will do is it'll basically amortize the fixed infrastructure costs over more payers and and more kilowatt hours that they're charging people for. So the bigger the business for them, the lower effect all that infrastructure has on our rates, right? So electrification of transportation and of buildings does nothing but good stuff for our rates. It actually keeps them lower.
Right on. Okay, well, we're going to track down what happens with that over the next couple of weeks and years ahead, actually, as that goes into place. But I wanted to update people on this idea of ending the $4 per hour hazard pay for grocery workers. Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda sponsored this legislation back in January. The council passed it, and the council said at the time, we're going to look at this again in 4 months. So they did, and as vaccination rates have improved, it looks like hazard pay is going to be lifted. But Kevin, you kept a close eye on the committee meeting surrounding this last week. I wanted to get your take on it. What did you see? What did you hear?
Well, it's interesting that for the most part, they're all kind of going along with this. Member Herbal jumped in and said, well, it looks to me like the mayor will probably lift her emergency declaration for COVID around the end of August, beginning of September.
Right.
And when that lifts, the hazard pay, according to the original ordinance that they passed,
legislation,
the hazard pay mandate will go away anyway. So why are we doing this?
Yeah.
And in fact, Councilmember Mosqueda, who's the sponsor of this bill to lift that now, came back and said, yeah, I'm sort of, aiming for this to take effect at the end of August, beginning of September anyway. Right?
Okay.
So in fact, they passed it out of committee last week, but it's not going to go up for the full committee, for the full council to approve it until July 26th.
Right.
And then it will take effect 30 days after the mayor signs it.
Right. So okay.
So they're still talking about basically end of August, beginning of September.
Okay. It'll be interesting to look at this. And just quickly on this, I know we touched on this. Was this successful in terms of getting the health outcomes that the council wanted to get out of it? Do you have any more insight on that?
Well, I think there were many health outcomes that the city council wanted that happened anyway.
Right. Yeah. Vaccination rates are doing really well citywide.
Vaccination rates are doing super well. And that's one of the biggest data points that the city council is looking at. There are also, Councilmember Mosqueda sort of listed off some of the programs that grocery store chains have been doing to encourage vaccination. The extra safety, precautions that they put in place in their stores around that. And, we're seeing some of those lift now, but still, many of them are still in place. And so, that sort of raises the question about whether the hazard pay is really needed at this point or not. And those questions, honestly were asked right at the beginning, and there wasn't a great answer as to why they were really needed in the first place.
All right. Well, we'll track down what happens with that at the end of this month, though. Thank you for that piece of this, Kevin. I wanted to ask one final question of you here in our first segment here. Would you pay $12 to park on the street in Seattle, folks? The council is trying to sort this out. So at a maximum of $5 an hour for parking in the city here, people are circling areas like Seattle Center, for example, looking for street parking because the garages, as we all know, cost a lot more. But that's bad for pollution. That's bad for traffic congestion. And this is going to be a big deal as the Seattle Kraken start playing at Climate Pledge Arena this fall. So SDOT is asking the city council right now for a maximum of $12 an hour in this legislation. We won't hit that max immediately. They're looking for a little flexibility here for now. They want a lower rate, SDOT does, for the first 2 hours, then $8 an hour for hours 3 through 5. Kevin, I'm just looking at this, and it's centered right now around Climate Pledge Arena in the Uptown neighborhood here. This could mean some big changes for that neighborhood.
It could, and this builds on some work that SDOT's been doing for the last several years. So we've all noticed around the city that, rather than have, the old style parking meters, they've switched to these sort of electronic kiosk things that cover kind of a block or so. And what that's done for the city is given them a lot more data about how much parking is being utilized in different areas. And so what they've been doing is they put in place a goal to say, we want we want on-street parking to be about 80%, 80 to 90% utilized, so that you don't have to drive more than a block or two to find an open spot if you really need to park somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And so we can raise and lower prices in order to keep it right about 80%. We don't want any, we're not trying to maximize revenue, so we're not going to make it higher than it needs to be.
Right.
We're going to make it high enough so that there's some open spaces. Enough people will go look for alternatives and hopefully take transit.
Right.
They won't have to do that, right? Yeah. So, and having electronic kiosks, not only gives them the data, but also gives them the ability to change parking rates over the course of the day. Right?
Yeah.
So what they're doing in the Seattle Center area is a couple of things. First of all, they're expanding some of the restricted parking zone areas because they realize it's also a residential and commercial area.
Yeah.
Right. There people need to
be able to park around there. Sure. Yeah.
Around residences, visiting friends, around going to businesses there.
Right.
But then they're also going to expand out the street parking area, and they're going to use the capability they now have, so that for most of the day, they're hoping it'll still be 50 cents an hour.
Right. Okay.
But they'll raise it a little bit at the first couple of hours of a major event. And a major event at Seattle Center means 10,000 people
at least.
more.
Yeah. Right.
And then for the last 3 hours of an event, they'll raise it up to at first $8 an hour. But they're asking for more authority than that, so that they have the flexibility to play with that up and down.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask too, the original legislation here was talking about any place in Seattle where you'd get 10,000 plus folks, which would potentially mean the SoDo stadiums as well.
The stadium area,
yeah. And Councilmember Morales had some concerns about that. Apparently not enough outreach going on with Pioneer Square and Chinatown ID. Let's talk about that other piece.
Yeah, Morales said that she had talked to folks in her district, which includes the Chinatown International District, and they said that there were complaints that SDOT had not done enough outreach to them. Yeah. Okay. And SDOT said, we're not planning on doing any of this around the stadiums right now. That's something we'd look at in the future. And of course you do outreach, but Morales said, let's just legislate that now. So this authority they have to raise it up to $12 an hour is just for within 1 mile of Seattle Center right now.
Right. And that's going to be important because the Kraken start playing in October. So they got to get something cooking here pretty soon.
And I think 1 mile is sort of pretty much the distance people are going to sort of park on the street and then walk to get to Climate Pledge Arena.
Yeah. Call it the CPA. We're gonna have to figure out a cool name for that thing.
We'll come up with a name.
Yeah. I'm sure we will. All right. Well, thanks for that. We're going to take a deep dive coming up next year on the investigation into 2 officers from the SPD who participated in the January 6th insurrection at the nation's capital. That's ahead on Now Hear This. Well, it's a story that continues to unfold this week. The Office of Police Accountability says 2 of the 6 off-duty officers from the SPD who attended the rally that led to the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol should be fired for violating SPD policy and unprofessional conduct. Kevin and Omari Salisbury talked about this, I should say, on Converge Media with OPA Director Andrew Meyerberg. Here's what Mr. Meyerberg said about what the officers did, or more specifically, did not do, and his reaction to it.
For me, it goes to the professionalism allegation. It's, you're sitting there as law enforcement officers, you're seeing what's going on, you're doing nothing, you're saying nothing, and you're just watching this occur. And this is really, for most of us, I've never seen anything like it before. And the fact that you would do nothing is pretty disturbing.
This case disturbing in many different ways, Kevin, and I want to try to do the hits, runs, and errors first if we could. 6 officers in total were investigated here. The evidence shows only 2 illegally trespassed on Capitol grounds and, as you heard, did nothing to stop the insurrection they saw in front of them. Another officer, evidence inconclusive that he was on the Capitol grounds during the insurrection. Another one, this is interesting, evidence shows he was not around for the insurrection, but he refused to cooperate with the OPA, so some separate charges of insubordination coming there. Kevin, if we could, I'm going to try to start from the very beginning here, how the OPA looked into this. This is a long, exhaustive investigation we're talking about here. How did they do this and find this evidence?
Yeah, they had a bunch of different threads going on. They, of course, interviewed all 6 officers and other SPD personnel they talked to, and informed ahead of time that they're going to be in DC that day. Right. They sent 2 of their investigative supervisors out to Washington, DC, They talked to the DC Metropolitan Police, the Capitol Police, the FBI. They went to the restaurants that the officers said that they went to for lunch that day. They went to the hotels where they stayed.
Yeah.
They got surveillance footage. They, you know, talked to waiters and hotel staff.
Right.
They got the door swipe timestamps from their hotel rooms, so they could verify when they went into their rooms. So they got a fair amount of stuff. And for the two officers that they have, you know, sustained charges against, really the most damning part of that was the FBI gave them video footage, well, gave them still photos from a video that showed them basically in the immediate vicinity of the Capitol. The two officers had said we were farther away. We didn't see any signs that it was a prohibited area, and we didn't see any signs of anybody doing anything illegal. And this footage from the FBI just completely undermines that. It shows that they were clearly in prohibited area, and there were illegal stuff going on all around them.
Yeah, and that's a big deal. I mean, the OPA really looking at that and saying these officers are not credible if they're saying something along those lines.
They're not credible. And so it's two parts. Number one, you know, the evidence, you know, undermined their arguments, so and verified that they had in fact broken the law by illegally trespassing, and, you know, broken other, you know, SPD policy by not reporting or responding to crimes that they're witnessing. But on top of that, they basically lied. And under the collective bargaining agreement that SPOG, their union, signed, dishonesty is grounds for termination.
Yes, it can be.
So in fact, I mean, already what they've done is pretty much grounds for termination. And that was the recommendation from the discipline board to Chief Diaz that he's going to have to look at. But you know, beyond that, there's still probably going to be an investigation of them for dishonesty. And that is also grounds for termination.
Right. There's so many different pieces here, and I wanted to talk about that SPOG back and forth there with the chief, because it sounded like SPOG was getting involved with this very early and trying to influence what was happening here. SPOG pushing back, the OPA saying SPOG even tried to get Chief Diaz to stop parts of the OPA investigation here, and that was very interesting to me to hear that.
Yeah, so this is super complicated. There's a couple different threads. You know, on one hand, you know, SPOG is their union, and it represents them in, you know, personnel disputes, right? That's just a standard practice. That's a standard practice for, you know, pretty much all unions, right? That's what you expect union reps to do. So, you know, we can't really fault them for doing that and for, you know, aggressively trying to
standing up for their people.
Standing up for the people, right? So in this case, what gets challenging and difficult is that OPA doesn't have subpoena authority over SPD officers. They can issue subpoenas for, you know, third parties, for witnesses, for all sorts of things like that, but they can't do, under the terms of the collective bargaining agreement with SPOG, they can't subpoena records from the officers themselves.
And this was a piece that was actually negotiated during the 2017 accountability legislation. I know that's a big piece of this. Keep going.
It's a big controversial deal about that. So, however, Chief Diaz has the authority as a police department to order them to turn over personal records.
That's right. So this was a chief's order, as his point.
So OPA made the request of them to turn over the personal documents, you know, receipts from going to the restaurant and, you know, from the hotel, you know, text messages with timestamps, just like the whole set, like show us what you got that corroborates your story. Right. And SPOG said, oh, is this an official sort of police authorized order? And OPA Director Myberg said yes. And then SPOG went to Chief Diaz and said, we want you to refuse to issue this, you know, this as a police authorized order. And Diaz said, no, I'm not going to do that. This is, I see this as a reasonable order underneath in request. So SPOG has actually filed a grievance against this. They think it's illegal, and that's going to go through the grievance arbitration process and all that, and that will, you know, drag out for a while.
I wanted to touch on what the chief is going to do, because he's gone on record about this. He's not happy about having police officers involved in the insurrection. From what I've seen in the data, 31 officers from around the U.S. actually showed up at this insurrection. That's what the data shows. And
those are the ones we know about.
Yeah, the ones we know about. Thank you. 6 of them that we know about were from Seattle, which I don't know how you look at this, but that's the largest representation of any one agency within that 31 we're talking about. So
again, that we know about.
That we know about.
We don't know how many departments actually asked their officers, "Hey, did you go to this thing?"
Right. Okay. All right.
There are a lot of red states right around DC where it'd be easy for them to take a day trip over to be part of that.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring it up because I'm trying to figure out what the chief is going to do here. He has said he would fire officers who participated in the insurrection. He's got about a 30-day window right now to make the call here.
So the official process is that the 2 officers get to what's called a Loudermill hearing, right? Under U.S. Supreme Court ruling, civil servants have to be given, who are facing discipline, including potentially termination, have to be given an opportunity for hearing with their employer where they can state their side of the case before the employer makes the discipline decision. So there's going to be a Loudermill hearing for them, and then Chief Diaz is going to make their decision. And I think I remember last week OPA Director Meyerberg told me what date it was scheduled for. I think it was sometime, in the last week of July. It's officially scheduled for right now. And then he can make his decision anytime after that.
Wow, that's going to be a big piece here. But I did want to make sure I brought up some of the other players involved here too. Councilmember Herbold weighing in here, the Community Police Commission weighing in here too. Some different thoughts about what those different agencies, or council member in the case of Councilmember Herbold, what they're saying about this and how that factors in.
Yeah, there's a couple different pieces. Certainly, CPC has said they're glad that charges, have been sustained against these 2. And and Herbold said that she wished they'd gone further and inquired more about whether the police officer, any of the 6 police officers, knew in advance that there had been insurrection was happening, that there were people planning for violence that day,
which is indicated in a lot of different social media reports. Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. So, but really, I think for a lot of folks, the tricky question here is all 6 have admitted that they were actually at the rally, right? And remember, this day had 2 parts to it, right?
Yeah.
There was the quote unquote Stop the Steal rally,
right?
Happened at one end of the mall, right? And then a bunch of them, thousands of people marched down the mall to the Capitol, and that's where the insurrection happened, right?
Yeah.
And there's lots of heavy words said at the Stop the Steal rally, including by Trump.
Yes.
But nobody has really said that anything illegal happened there.
Right.
But there were clearly a lot of speakers who were trying to make the case or argue that the election had been stolen, right?
Yes.
Without any evidence, right? All the evidence had been debunked. They didn't have any solid evidence at that time. So they were basically fabricating a story about what happened.
Yeah, that's what it turned into.
And so how do we feel about officers taking part in that?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And
it's there's freedom of speech. Yeah, keep going.
They, the Constitution, the First Amendment protect right of assembly and right to have a minority view.
Yes, of course.
Right. And to say it. At the same time, there are limits to that, right? There are hate speech laws.
Right.
So, what Meyerberg said he had to do is he really had to sort of look at and follow the court precedents for what kind of speech is allowed and what kind of speech isn't. And he couldn't find any precedents that said that, anything that was said at that rally was illegal, right?
Wow.
That would make their participation in it illegal.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
So, and he wasn't going to jump in and start saying, well, a rally on this topic is good and this topic is bad. On the other hand, it's interesting, when Omari and I were talking with Andrew Meyerberg last week, Omari brought up the really good point that there is, a long history of police officers going to rallies.
Yes,
right?
of course.
And, long time ago, and maybe even still occasionally now,
Yeah.
going to a lot of those rallies wearing white hoods.
Yeah. Right.
So, there are really, really good questions we have to continue to ask about the kind of culture we expect our police departments to have, and the behavior that we expect them to show when they're not wearing their uniform.
Yeah.
And what do we do about that?
Yeah.
Right? And recognizing that there's still U.S. citizens, right?
Of course.
They still have constitutional rights.
Absolutely.
To free speech,
yeah.
Right. And how do we find that right balance? And there is no good answer to this question.
No.
It's a very, very difficult question to ask.
No. And I know we're going to be wrestling with this over the next several weeks. So thank you for breaking all those different pieces down with me on this one, Kevin. I'm going to move on right now to our next segment here. We're talking about fair chance housing in court. What's the presiding judge saying about it? That's in our final segment here. What's next? Kevin, I wanted to update our listeners on what's going on with Seattle's Fair Chance Housing Ordinance. This is the measure that bans landlords from asking about a prospective or current tenant's criminal history or using that against them in some way. The Rental Housing Association, representing landlords, filed suit. It says this ordinance violates their rights to due process.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callahan Media Services. Copyright 2021.
What is the standard of review the court would use to make a ruling here? Can you try to break this down for me, talking about due process, talking about free speech? I know the judge was talking about this quite a bit.
Right. So, we like to, in our heads, it's easy to sort of come up with this view that like the government cannot intrude upon our constitutional rights.
Right.
And it's actually not true. Right. The government can, but what the courts do is they have, but not always. And so the courts have different standards of review, so that if somebody challenges a government regulation that intrudes upon their constitutional rights, they can say, is this justified?
Right. Yep.
So in this particular case, the Rental Housing Association said, there are two constitutional rights that we think this violates. One is kind of a minor one, which is property rights.
Yes.
Right? And the major one, which is really the heart of the case, was free speech.
Yes.
And the standard of review for each of those is different.
Right.
Standard of review for the property rights part of this, actually, this case has been around for coming up on 2.5 years now.
Yeah. Right.
And in 2019, this U.S. District Court judge kicked the question of sort of what's the standard of review for property rights in Washington State over to the Washington State Supreme Court.
Right.
And they came back and said, it's the federal standard. We follow the federal standard.
Okay.
So that made it a little easier for him.
Yes.
The federal standard for this has, he explained in his ruling last week on this, is what they call rational basis, which is the very lowest level. It's like if the city has any rational basis for doing this, and it may not even be the one that they stated when they passed this bill. If the judge can conceive of any rational reason for this legislation, then it's fine.
Right. So that's
the free speech. The free speech one depends on the kind of speech and who, sort of what the context is, who's doing it, and whether it's commercial speech or non-commercial speech.
Yeah.
And so the most protected speech is is around general speech, and in particular for political speech.
Yes. Right.
That gets what's called strict scrutiny.
Yes.
Right. That's the highest standard that the government has to meet in order to sustain a regulation on that.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
Hate speech being something that
sure. Okay.
That, right? Okay. And so if strict scrutiny is the highest and rational basis is kind of lowest, in the middle there's a whole bunch of kind of different sort of gradations within there, but generally that's all call that what's called intermediate scrutiny.
Okay.
And when speech is commercial speech, when it's about commerce, and when it's businesses doing it as opposed to individuals doing it, then the government has said, yeah, that's really intermediate scrutiny.
Okay.
That's not as protected as general sort of you and I, non-commercial and particular political speech. Right? And so there's a set of rules that they use called the Central Hudson test to see if, like, is there a justification for the government restricting this kind of Is it speech about illegal acts?
Yeah.
Is it, there's a whole set of rules around that.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
And so the judge came back and kind of both sides made their best case about whether, it meets that standard.
Yes.
And the judge came back and said, this particular rule meets the standard.
Yeah.
Right. The city is actually justified in doing this within
ruled for the city
scrutiny.
here. Yeah.
The one place where it was a little weak.
Yeah.
In the judge's argument around this was there is an area where this bill is a little overbroad.
Okay,
because it says that it prohibits any person from inquiring about a renter's criminal history.
Yeah, not just a landlord.
That could mean you or me. It could mean a journalist.
Yeah,
a journalist inquiring about a renter's criminal history.
Right.
Or an employer.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And the city said, yeah, you could technically read the bill to say that, but we're not going to interpret that way.
Yeah.
And the judge said, all right, I hear you. I agree. Technically, you could read it that way.
Right.
But I hear you that you're not going to. So we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And you didn't have to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And and this is going to get appealed.
Yeah, I was going to say
probably of all the parts of this, that is the most likely part that would lead the Ninth Circuit Court to say, nah,
yeah, right.
You got to, nah.
Yeah, we got to do better there. Okay. Well, thank you for breaking all that down. I know this is a years-long case that's keeping on going, but we need to follow up on that, and we will continue to do that. But it's time to wrap up the show, Kevin, and as we always do, looking at the sweet treats you can have on your coffee break. Kevin, it is a return to scones in the Callanan home right now. Yeah, feast your eyes once again. This is the lavender scone with the little vanilla icing on top that my daughter makes in such a lovely way. So good.
That was a very tiny bite.
I know.
I a lot of discipline today.
I'm trying because usually you know me. I take these monster bites and I can't speak for. Well, they've been saying that about me for years, but I can't speak for the end of this thing, and it sounds awful. But I wanted to talk about my daughter has this baking technique where she freezes the butter before grating it and takes that grated butter and puts it into the recipe. I think she's kind of crazy, but that's mainly because she's related to me. But I think there is some method to the madness there. Can you explain this idea? Freezing butter, grating it. Why is that a thing?
Yeah. So when you're using butter, particularly for pastry, you actually want it to be solid. You don't want it to be soft where it sort of just evenly distributes it. You want actually chunks of it, because what happens to the butter is, butter is a mixture of milk solids and water.
Oh yeah.
Right. And what you want to happen is when it's baking, the water evaporates, but the milk solids give it enough structure that you get sort of airy fluffiness still inside of it.
Well, you got that right.
If you let the butter all get soft and then it just sort of evenly mixes, you don't get that, right?
This is true.
So in a lot of baking, in particular in pastry related things, where you want that kind of buttery, fluffiness,
goodness, yes,
it calls for really chilling the butter, and then often what you'll do is you throw it, with the flour in a food processor.
Yeah, there you go.
And you process it just enough so you get chunks about pea size. Right?
Okay.
So this notion of freezing it and grating it is sort of the same thing. Right? You get chunks of butter that get spread pretty evenly. The hard part about doing this is that if you want to keep the butter in that solid state, you have to work it as little as possible.
I see.
Right.
Okay.
And particularly, you can't work it with your hands because all the heat
warm
comes
it up.
off all your body heat is going to come off and will start melting it. So you end up with a dough that you just have to minimally work. You have to work super fast. Like you see bakers working, you're doing pie crust, things like that. They chill the butter, they pull it out, they throw it in the food processor, they grind. They do a very, very quick mix. They don't knead it at all.
Right.
And then try to get it back in the fridge as soon as possible, right? Because they want to keep those solid chunks in there, because that's the thing that's going to give it its fluffiness.
That is the goodness. I knew my daughter wasn't completely crazy. Thank you for helping me verify at least that part of it.
She's right on.
She's right on. Good to hear. All right. Well, thank you, Kevin. And thanks always to our patrons here. Please do support us on Patreon. We're hoping to get your support at the $10 level so we can send you one of these cool mugs here. Thank you for keeping our show going. And a big thanks to everybody out there who is listening. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you might listen. Again, Please do become a patron on Patreon if you like what you're hearing. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media 2, and we will see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2021.